know, this is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
Tonight, we are diving in to Stalking the Wild Pendulum on the Mechanics of Consciousness by Itzhak Bentov. Itzhak Bentov was a dude who dropped out in 8th grade and went on to become a philosopher and theoretical king on the cosmos and consciousness and how to break free from consciousness and the exploration of psychic abilities and why they're real and why entities from beyond are also real, but we'll get into that. So much so that the CIA picked up the book and they're like, we're going to turn this into the gateway process to help our field agents break free from consciousness and access psychic abilities. So I'm excited to dive into this one, and let's see what old Itzhak has to say. We're going to start with the introduction. Well, an amuse-bouche of the introduction, where we're going to get into just a bit of what the book's about, and then an apology at the end of the intro that I think Itzhak would want us to read. So what are we about to get into? I am attempting in this book to build a model of the universe that will satisfy the need for a comprehensive picture of what our existence is all about. In other words, a holistic model that encompasses not only the physical observable universe that is our immediate environment and the distant universe observed by our astronomers, but also other realities as well. Normally, we do not consider the emotional, mental, and intuitive components of our beings as realities. I will try to persuade you that they are. The phenomena that we call unexplained, like psychokinesis, the moving of an object with the power of the mind, telepathy, out-of-body phenomena, clairvoyance, etc., can all be explained once we know the general underlying principles governing them. So get ready for that. And the apology at the end. I must apologize to women readers for calling the creator he. A creator is neither he nor she, but both. But somehow, I couldn't bring myself to call him chairperson of the universe. I don't think he would go for that, nor could I face him in good conscience afterward. And here is a little symbol he includes. A little cool question mark snake-like thing in a triangle in the middle of the sun. I don't know. Chapter 1, Sound Waves and Vibration. That's all it is. We are constantly surrounded by sound. We even have a highly specialized opening in our heads for making sounds that may be meaningful to other people. We communicate through sound. In fact, it is our major means of communication. When we disturb the air in any way, we create sound. The slightest motion of our bodies disturbs the air around us, and we produce sound. When we raise our hand, we compress the air in its way, and that compressed air front will travel away from us at a speed of sound, which is about 740 miles per hour. It's just sent 3 waves, 740 miles per hour at you. Brace yourself. When we make periodic movements with our hand, the sound becomes a note. By sound, we mean here any random acoustical disturbance that may be composed of many different frequencies. A note, on the other hand, is a sound of a single frequency. It may not be audible because of its low frequency. We call this kind of sound infrasound. That is, sound below our level of perception. However, when a fly or mosquito beats its wings, it does it fast enough, and we sure can hear it. The rapid flapping of its wings produces evenly spaced compressions and rarefications of the air that become audible to us. In short, a fly or a mosquito is producing a sound or a note. Let us try to make sound in a less obvious way. We shall take a short piece of wire, connect both of its ends to a battery through a switch, and close the switch. We were told in school that 3 things happen. 1, that electrical current will run from one side of the battery to the other. 2, that a magnetic field perpendicular to that current will shoot out and expand all the way to infinity at the velocity of light, which is about 186,000 miles per second. And 3, that the wire will heat up slightly. They probably did not tell us that when the wire heats up, it expands, and by doing so, it will clearly force the air out of its way and make a kind of sound. Or that as the mass of the wire is accelerated in this way, it will produce gravitational waves, since any time a mass is accelerated, it will broadcast gravitational waves, which will again expand to infinity at the velocity of light. Some will say that the gravitational waves will certainly be almost infinitesimally weak, but that does not worry us as long as they are there. So our action of closing the switch has been broadcast, theoretically at least, to the outer limits of the atmosphere around the Earth due to the movement of the air, and was broadcast all the way to the end of the universe by the expansion of the magnetic field around the wire and by the gravitational wave due to the wire's acceleration. The purpose of this example is to show how in principle even our smallest, most insignificant actions will be broadcast far and wide and thus influence something or someone, whether that something or someone is aware of it or not. Who are we influencing? So watch out where you're sending your waves. You just got hit by all those 740 miles per hour. We should look now at other effects of sound. If we stretch a string on a frame, then pluck the string in the middle of its length, we shall see the outline of the string in the extreme positions of its movement. It forms two symmetrical arcs as shown. If we pluck the string at 1/4 mark of its length, we shall see a shape as in figure 2b. These are standing waves. We get such waves only when plucking the string at distances that will divide the string into integral numbers. In figure 2a, the frame length corresponds to half a wave, while in figure 2b, the frame accommodates a full wavelength. In figure 2b, the string has a point in the middle at which the string is at rest, and two more points at which it is attached to the frame. Such points of rest are called nodes. All other points of the string are vibrating up and down. When the nodes along the string appear stationary and fixed, while the rest of the string is vibrating, we call such behavior a standing wave. Suppose now we take a thin sheet of metal. Clamp it at one edge so that it stays in a horizontal position. Spread some dry sand evenly over the sheet. Then take a violin bow and draw it over one of the free edges of the sheet until it emits a note. Very soon we shall see the sand grains are collecting on the sheet in a symmetrical pattern. As we apply the bow at different points along the edge of the metal, we shall get different and quite beautiful patterns on the sheet. The reason for this aggregation of sand grains is that we are setting up the so-called standing waves in the metal. These standing waves in the metal sheet are two-dimensional versions of the standing wave in the string. These standing waves have active areas that vibrate up and down, and other areas are nodes that are quiescent. The sand grains will move away from the vibrating areas and accumulate in the quiescent areas. The sand grains like to be left in peace, and they will go to the quiet, low-energy places. This pattern in sand actually outlines for us the pattern of standing waves in the metal sheet. The standing waves automatically divide the length and width of the plate into an integral number of half wavelengths. Now check out this next one. It is only then that the standing waves can be sustained. This is so by definition. Standing waves could not exist until they divide their medium into an integral number of half waves. A standing wave having a fractional wavelength cannot be sustained. You just can't do it. We can also put it another way. The dimensions of the plate are the factors that govern what is the size or wavelength of the standing wave that can be sustained in the plate. When a structure is in resonance, which means that it vibrates at a frequency that is natural to it and is most easily sustained by it, it implies the presence of a standing wave. Let us see if we can visualize this kind of behavior in 3 dimensions. We could take a transparent box, like say this one here. Fill it with fluid and dispense particles in it with the same specific gravity as the fluid so that they stay dispersed in the fluid and do not sink to the bottom. Then by vibrating the walls of this box, from all 6 sides in a synchronous manner, we could cause these particles to aggregate in a symmetrical 3-dimensional pattern. This pattern will look just like a highly enlarged crystal, making a hologram. If we assume that the aggregated lumps are analogous to the atoms in the crystal, we have again produced a standing wave pattern in this box, which is a 3-dimensional analog for the standing wave in the string and the metal plate. At the same time, we have produced a 3-dimensional object analogous to the basic building blocks in nature, a highly ordered crystal. And we have done this simply by applying sound to an amorphous, disorganized suspension of particles. You know, it kind of makes me think about the Big Bang. I don't know if I'm crazy, but you know, the Big Bang, that's a big sound, right? And there was a bunch of just particles, or it was just a bunch of condensed particles. And then boom, all this. I don't know. In the box, we have set up an interference pattern of standing waves, which we will soon explain, that governs the position of the particles. In short, by using sound, we have introduced order where previously there was none. It may occur to us that a crystalline structure may be seen as representing sound interacting in a volume. Is it possible that the orderly pattern of atoms in matter is the result of the interaction of some kind of sound waves in matter? Now let us go one step beyond and see whether sound can also be used for storing information or knowledge. A shallow round pan and 3 pebbles are all we need for this experiment. Fill the pan with water. Now drop in the 3 pebbles simultaneously as shown in figure 6 and watch the ripples spread in the pan. Each pebble is the source of waves spreading evenly across the pan. Let us neglect the wavelets reflected back from the walls of the pan. These waves cross each other and create quite a complex pattern of wavelets on the surface of the water. They look pretty chaotic to us. There is, however, an order to the apparent chaos. All that has happened is that the wave produced by each individual pebble expanded and reached the edge of the pan. In so doing, the waves have crossed and interacted with each other on the way to the edges of the pan. This interaction created a complex pattern that is called an interference pattern. If we carefully analyze this pattern, however, we can trace back each wavelet to its source, the pebble. Let us now quick freeze the surface of the water in the pan and lift out the resulting rippled sheet of ice. We are holding in our hands a record of the interference pattern of waves, or we may even call it a hologram. Note on the experiment, I know we probably don't have anything that exists yet to freeze water that quickly, but this is an experiment of the mind. If you were able to do that, you'd be able to read it like a data sheet. The dropping of the pebbles recorded its data and kept it. Interference patterns and beat frequencies. In order to clarify what an interference pattern is, we have to learn about 2 additional properties of sound in its different forms. 1, constructive and deconstructive interference, and 2, beat frequencies. Let us take the first one in figure 7a. You will see what happens when 2 wave patterns of identical frequency and amplitude or wavelength meet. Let's try to superimpose them on each other. In figure 7a, we see that the hills and valleys of the frequencies in rows A and B match each other. If we superimpose them by measuring their heights or amplitudes from their respective baselines, then we find that hill matches hill, valley matches valley, and when added up, they produce a waveform twice the height of the original waveforms, as shown in row C. This is known as constructive interference because it builds up the amplitude. And you thought that interference was crazy? What do you see this next one? If we look now at figure 7b, we find that hills match valleys and valleys match hills. If we add them up, we shall find that they cancel each other out as the flat line in row C indicates. This is known as destructive interference. This is what is happening in our pan of water. If we look at the ripples in the ice sheet, we shall find that where hill meets hill, we end up with a hill double the original wave height. And where hill meets valley, we find just a flat spot. This is the nature of the interference pattern. However many forms of an interference patterns are possible, we may have them in a single dimension, as when we vibrate a string, or in 2 dimensions in our flat pan, or in 3 dimensions, as in our box in figure 5. Beat frequencies. Now that we know what an interference pattern is, it will be relatively easy to understand a beat frequency. In figure 7C, we see a frequency in row A. Let's say it's 50 cycles per second, and a frequency in row B, which let's say is 60 cycles per second. If we add them up as we did before, we shall discover an interesting phenomenon. Row C shows the result of adding 2 frequencies. What we see is a pearl-shaped wave from form superimposed on top of our A and B waveforms. The reason for this becomes obvious if we examine figure 7C carefully. Starting from the left, we see that row C, the amplitude, wave height, is low where the hills and valleys oppose each other, and high where both waveforms coincide or reinforce each other, which results in constructive interference. The patterns are said then to be in phase, to use a technical term. Now, as we move to the right, we notice that the A and B waves gradually go out of phase, and the hills start facing the valleys, thus opposing each other, which means that a destructive interference is occurring. This destructive interference reaches its maximum in every 5th cycle, forming a narrow quote-unquote waist in the amplitude or volume of the sound at those points. The pearly pattern in row C will therefore be a modulation of the basic sound, which has a fixed amplitude. Modulation means a change that is being caused in an otherwise smooth or even behavior. In our case, it means an increase and decrease of the amplitude or volume of the 50 and 60 cycle per second sound. This modulation will occur 10 times per second, with a minima occurring every 6 cycles. This 10 hertz modulation is called a beat frequency, and is the difference between the A and B frequencies. Were we to make A 10 cycles per second sound and B a 12 cycles per second sound, we would then have a 12 minus 10 equal 2 cycle per second beat frequency superimposed on these 2 base frequencies. The knowledge of these 2 properties of sound will be important towards the end of this book. Okay, I'm going to trust you on that. Note that the difference between the 2 fast frequencies produces a 3rd frequency that is much slower than the first 2. This then is a beautiful device for converting high frequencies to low ones. Now let's talk about nature's information storage. Let's go back now to the sheet of ice we lifted from the pan and find a proper light source to illuminate it. And that's this figure right here. We shall find, to our great surprise, that we can see the 3 pebbles suspended in midair if we look through the ice toward the light. They will look very 3-dimensional to us. This is totally an unexpected result. It seems that the rippled surface of the ice, or the interference pattern, has somehow stored the information about the whereabouts and shape of the pebbles. The ice surface acted as a distorted lens in such a way as to focus the light to points taken up by the pebbles that have caused all these ripples. The chaotic-looking ice surface is actually an information storage device. Suppose now that due to a momentary gap in the attention or plain clumsiness, the ice sheet slips out of our hands and drops on the floor and breaks. We sadly collect the pieces, but before throwing them all out, we hold up one of them and illuminate it in the same way that we did the large sheet. To our great surprise, we find the 3 pebbles again projected into midair. But how come? Doesn't matter. Yeah, that's what's so crazy about holograms. Any small piece of a hologram is actually the whole entire thing, which is like humans, right? You could take any small piece of us and you could clone it, use the DNA. You may remember that the information about the whereabouts of each pebble was carried by the waves moving to the edge of the pan. We know if we drop just a single pebble into the pan, it would be very easy for us to locate it. We would simply seek out the center of the concentric wave rings or wave fronts. We also know that the waves form that the waves from each pebble cross the surface of the whole pan. Naturally, they must have interacted with each other across the whole surface of the pan on every square centimeter of its surface. We can show it like this. The arcs created by each pebble are crossing a small piece of the surface, and each arc can be traced back to its origin. This is the basic principle of the hologram. However, I would not recommend that you actually try to perform the experiment just described. It will not work in practice for certain complicated technical reasons, which we shall bypass, but it is perfectly useful for the purpose of explaining the workings of the most exciting information storage device, the hologram. It is nature's way of storing information. There is already evidence that our brains store information in holographic form. This kind of storage device is the most compact known in nature. An example of this is the genetic code, in which you look at those sound wave diagrams, they looked like DNA strands, the way it looped in together. So he's talking about our genetic code and our chromosomes. Each cell in our bodies carries all the information required to make an additional copy of our bodies. Holograms. Our success in storing information in the system just described depends naturally on the predictable and orderly behavior of the waves in the pan. They must be consistent both in velocity and in distance between the waves or wavelengths. This is what makes them reliable as carriers of information. Otherwise, we would all we would get is a hodgepodge of waves. Here is where coherency comes in. It would be good at this point to describe the way a real hologram is made so that you become familiar with this important concept. By coherency, we mean an order of a certain kind. In this case, we shall talk about coherent light, without which a good hologram cannot be made. The most popular source of coherent light is a laser. The first important aspect of laser light is that it produces light of a single frequency. We all know that our sun sends us light that can be broken down by a prism into a spectrum containing all the colors of the rainbow. A laser produces light of just a single color from that rainbow, which we call monochromatic light. In addition, the light emitted by the laser is coherent or goes in steps. By that we mean that all the light coming out of the source is moving forward in even flat fronts. This makes it possible for the laser light to stay in a narrow beam over large distances. There is a better way to describe coherency. Suppose we have a parade and a company of soldiers marching in military fashion down a main street. How lovely, Itzhak. What's going to happen in this parade? They are moving along 10 abreast very carefully, aligned in each row. The distances between the rows are fixed, which is the same to the even distances between the crests of light waves, that they are carefully aligned abreast, none of them sticking out of the line, is analogous to the light being in phase or in step. In short, the row of soldiers is the same to the light emitted by the laser beam. Suppose now that a slip-up occurs, and one of the soldiers, not watching his fellows, shifts out of his row, moves forward and steps on the heel of the fellow in front of him. The latter panics, thinking that he is lagging behind, and he jumps forward and bumps into the fellow ahead of him. Now this starts a general panic in which the soldiers bumping into each other disrupt the nice even width moving column. The neat column diverges, broadens, and then opens up completely in great disorder, in spite of the fact that their commander is blowing his whistle, tearing at his hair, and using strong language to get his men back into line. What we have learned from this disastrous parade is that a beam of light can stay in a narrow beam similar to a laser's beam only as long as it is coherent. When coherency is lost, the beam will tend to expand rapidly, just as will the beam of a regular flashlight. All right, now let's get to the good stuff, the hologram. We have seen before that information can be stored by an interference pattern of waves. To have interference, we must have at least two interacting components, and here is how it is done. The laser light beam is split into two components by a half mirror. That is a semi-transparent mirror. This allows part of the beam to continue undisturbed while part of it is deflected to another mirror. Both narrow beams are spread open by lenses. The upper beam, which we shall call the reference beam, arrives at a photographic plate after an eventless flight. Since no event of note has occurred on its way to the plate, it proceeds then to deposit its imprint on the film. The other half of the beam we shall call the working beam. This beam's trip had an event. It had encountered on its way an object, in this case an apple, that it had illuminated and with which it had interacted. We don't consider encounters through mirrors and lenses as worthwhile talking about. The working beam will then be reflected from the apple and fall on the film. There it will meet its twin, the reference beam, and it will tell it all about its experiences with the apple. The interaction between the two beams will cause ripples to form between them, which will form the interference patterns we are already familiar with, since the light waves will behave in this case the same way as do water waves. However, these ripples do not at all resemble the shape of the apple, but as we already know, the ripples in a photographic emulsion do contain information, and that information can be elicited from the film by illuminating the exposed film with the same light used in making the hologram, and that's in this here. So check this out. That basically is this. As we do that, we shall see the apple appear suspended in midair and looking very three-dimensional and real. We could easily be deceived when viewing an image reconstructed from a hologram that we were seeing the actual object. Note that the important part of holographic image making is that the interaction of a reference beam, a beam that is pure, virgin, and untouched, with a working beam which has had some experiences in its life. The magnitude of these experiences is being measured against the reference beam, which serves as a baseline for comparison. Our whole reality is constructed by constantly making such comparisons. Our senses, which describe our reality to us, are making these comparisons all the time. Unfortunately, our senses, having no absolute reference line, must generate their own relative reference line. Or whenever we perceive something, we always perceive differences only. It would be useful to take one example from nature to see how such differences are put to use in a very obvious way. Take the bat, for instance. Ooh, the lovely bat. I've caught and re-released 3 bats in my lifetime. They love to sneak into my house in the summertime. Thankfully, none have snuck in this year, but I love those little guys. We all know that these little mouse-like fellows live on insects that they catch in flight. Since they are active at night, they have developed a sonar-like device that serves them very well and enables them to make a reasonably easy living. He has a highly specialized structures in his head that allow him to emit a very high frequency sound and direct it in a fairly narrow beam. This is his reference beam. As the beam encounters a flying insect, some of this sound will be reflected back to the bat. He picks up the echo, or we can call it the working beam, and compares it to his original squeak or chirp. There will be a difference between the two, called the Doppler effect. And this difference tells the bat how far away the insect is and how fast it is flying relative to him. As the bat successfully closes in on the insect, the difference between the two frequencies, the emitted frequency and the echo, diminishes. When it becomes very small, the bat opens its mouth and swallows the echo. Some echoes, as the bat surely knows, are tastier than others. We see now that by appreciating the difference between the two sounds or vibrations, one can get along quite well in life. There are many creatures that make a living by appreciating differences in sound. Porpoises, whales, and many others. We humans also utilize this technique in less obvious ways, in color vision, hearing, etc. Oscillators and resonant systems. You may describe an oscillator as any object that moves in a regular, periodic manner. We may call a vibrating string an oscillator, or a weight hanging from a spring, or a pendulum, anything that performs a repetitive, periodic movement as such. That is, vibrates. We may generalize and say that oscillators produce a sound or a note, whether audible or not, as long as they alter their environment in a periodic manner. That environment may be tissue, as in the heart aorta, oscillating system, water, air, electrical fields, gravitational fields, or anything else. Suppose we tune 2 violins and put one of them on the table and play a note on the other. If we watch carefully, we shall see that the same string that we are playing on one violin is also humming on the violin that we placed on the table. Clearly, there is a sympathetic resonance between the two. Let us analyze what is happening. When we draw the bow over the string, it vibrates as its own natural frequency. We call self-frequency. Since 2 violins are correctly tuned, we know that the natural frequency of both strings were identical. Within a system like this, we shall call the two violin system, it is very easily to transfer energy. In this case, we are talking about acoustical energy. The airwaves generated by the first violin impinge on the second violin. The string that is tuned to the emitted note will absorb the energy of the waves of that frequency, preferentially because the energy comes to it as its own natural frequency. The energy transfer within this system is therefore optimum. And such a system made up of two tuned oscillators is called a resonant system, resonating together. Let us take another example. Suppose this. We get several old-fashioned pendulum-type grandfather clocks. Let us hang them on a wall and arrange their pendulums so that they will start out beating at each at a different angle. That is, out of phase with each other. In a day or two, we shall find that all the pendulums are beating in phase, as if locked together. Pendulum length should be the same for all of them. Here we see that the tiny amount of energy that was transmitted through the wall from the clock to clock was sufficient to bring them into phase with each other. If we disturb one of the clocks, it will get locked into rhythm quite fast. The larger the number of oscillators within the system, the more stable the system, and the more difficult it is to disturb. It will force a wayward oscillator back into line very quickly. Now let's get to the sound of the body. The heart is a big noisemaker. We can easily check this by putting our ear on someone's chest and listening to it. Each beat shakes the whole body, and the body has a typical response to this beat, which is quite easily measured. Figure 13 shows what such motion looks like when measured with a sensitive seismograph-like instrument. This movement is clearly related to the heartbeat. In fact, the largest peak we see in this graph is caused by the ejection of blood from the heart's left ventricle. The portion between the large peaks look fairly irregular, and this is caused by the vibration of the body due to the action of the blood in the aorta, which is the largest artery in our body. This irregular portion is due to a destructive interference pattern set up in the aorta, as will be shown later. Here you go, but here's the aorta, that's what he's talking about. Boom! It's the largest, explosion of blood in your body that's just constantly going on, like a geyser, getting all the blood being pushed up through your body. When we stop breathing, the irregular signal in figure 13 turns into a nice, regular, practically sine wave pattern. This is surprising. And when we look into the reasons for this behavior, we find that the heart aorta system has become a so-called resonant system, as shown in figure 15. In which the length of the aorta forms 1/2 a wavelength of this system. By resonant system, we mean that it resonates just like a tuned musical instrument. We each have our own note, our own heartbeat, right? That's what he's getting at, our own beat frequency. Each of us humans. Here is what seems to be the case. When the left ventricle of the heart ejects blood, the aorta, being elastic, balloons out just beyond the valve and causes a pressure pulse to travel down along the aorta. You see that in figure 16. When the pressure pulse reaches the bifurcation in the lower abdomen, which is where the aorta forks into two to go into the legs, part of the pressure pulse rebounds and starts traveling up the aorta. If in the meantime the heart ejects more blood and the new pressure pulse is traveling down, these two pressure fronts will eventually collide somewhere along the aorta and produce an interference pattern. This is reflected in the movement of the body and is the reason for the irregular heartbeat pattern in figure 13. However, when breathing stops, it looks as if some communication has been set up between the heart and the bifurcation. Some kind of signal seems to travel from the bifurcation to the heart, saying to it, "Heart, hold it. Hold your next pulse until the echo from the bifurcation returns to you. Only then should you eject the next quantity of blood." When this happens and the echo and pulse move out of the heart together and they continue to move up and down in synchrony, then such a system is said to be in resonance. It causes the body to move harmoniously up and down about 7 times a second, hence a nice regular large amplitude sine wave pattern in figure 14. That's these here. So when we're chilling and breathing, this is us. Crazy pattern. When we hold our breath, nice pattern. The body is in resonance. The amplitude or height of this signal is about 3 times the average of the normal signal. Other characteristics of resonant behavior is that it requires for its sustenance a minimum amount of energy. Well, now how long can we hold our breath? Certainly not over a minute or so comfortably. And so we start breathing and ruin the nice rhythmic pattern. Let us not forget that our body includes our head, and inside the skull, carefully packaged, is a very delicate instrument. Now careful, let's start our little brains in there. Just delicate like a peaches and syrup brain. The brain is cushioned by a thin layer of fluid and is wrapped in a tight bag of dura. About the simplest way to visualize this is to have a relatively soft round fruit, such as a peach, enclosed in a can containing a heavy syrup. If we shake the can, we find that the peach will hit the top and bottom of the can and be accelerated with a small delay in the direction which the can is moving. This movement is quite small, only 0.005 to 0.10 millimeters. This is exactly what happens to the brain. The question is, how come we are not aware of this happening to us? It's probably because when something is happening to the nervous system for an extended period of time, and that event is not traumatic, it will not be brought to our conscious attention because the portion of the brain that is in charge of censoring and separating meaningful signals from unmeaningful ones will regulate it to the heap of unimportant signals, which require no conscious processing. We know from experience that we can easily get used to and disregard a loud ticking of a clock next to us or the noise in the cabin of an airplane. The noise is, however, filed away somewhere and affects us in some subtle ways. If we were to ask the brain how it would like to be treated, whether shaken at random, irregular rate, or in a rhythmic, harmonious fashion, we can be sure the brain, or for that matter, the whole body, would prefer the latter. Let us take another example. When electronic circuits are built so that they contain oscillators of electronic type common in radio and TV circuits that happen to oscillate at frequencies that are close enough to each other, there will be a tendency of the oscillators to get locked in step with each other and oscillate at a frequency of one of them. Usually it is the fastest oscillator that will force the slower ones to operate at its pace. Here again, nature feels that it is more economical if 2 or any number of oscillators that vibrate at frequencies close enough to each other work together rather than insist on keeping their small differences. You know what? Yeah, let's just all, why can't we all just get along is what the universe wants? Allegedly. Major effects of rhythm entertainment occur in nature. Our biological rhythms are entrained by light and to a certain extent by gravitational effects. These are 2 of the most obvious factors. However, magnetic, electromagnetic, atmospheric, and subtle geophysical effects influence us in ways that are not presently well understood. We usually get up with daylight and go to sleep at night. The sleep-wake cycles of animals and birds are more strongly tied to the light-dark cycle of those of our quote-unquote civilized humanity because we have developed artificial sources of light and can change our light-dark cycle at will. However, we all know that when our light-dark cycle, which runs our biological clocks, is drastically altered, as when we take a long jet flight in an east-west direction and cross several time zones, and such an interference with our biorhythm has quite a marked effect on our ability to function in the new environment for a day or two. An interesting experiment was performed by Professor Frank Brown Jr. of Northwestern University, Evanston, Illinois. In order to check out what factors influence the biorhythm of animals, he had some live oysters shipped from his lab to Long Island at a distance of about 1,000 miles in an east-west direction. These oysters open and close their valves in a rhythm with the tides. The animals were shipped in tight, opaque containers filled with seawater. Upon arrival, they were stored in a lab with no natural daylight. On first examination, the oysters geared to the rhythm of tides in Long Island Sound, and they kept opening and closing their valves. In about 2 weeks, they started shifting their rhythm, and a while later, they stabilized in a rhythm that coincided with the passage of the moon over Evanston, Illinois. In this case, we may assume that the oysters were indeed rhythm entertained by the gravitational effects of the moon. However, it is not only we, the tiny creatures of this planet, who are rhythm entertained. The big and mighty asteroids and the planets themselves are rhythm entertained and develop resonances in their orbits as they rotate about the sun, as above, so below. Asteroids, which are minor planets, will not only respond to the gravitational pull of the sun, but will also be strongly affected by the gravitational fields of the major planets. They must dance, so to speak, in the tune of 2 masters. And so the asteroids develop little dances to the music So the asteroids develop little dances to the music of the spheres in which they pay tribute to the forces involved. They go into resonant orbits and describe minor loops around the planets within their major loop around the sun. All the phenomenon described in this chapter are periodic repetitive nature. We have made a generalization at the beginning saying that when such a rhythmic movement occurs, it affects its environment, whether that environment is air, water, solids, electromagnetic, or gravitational fields. In the case of air, water, or a solid, these vibrations will affect our near environment only and can be called sound. If we shake our electromagnetic gravitational fields, the disturbance in the environment will travel faster and farther. We will still apply the word sound to it, although it will be a sound of a different kind, since it would travel at the velocity of light. We could actually associate our whole reality with sound of one kind or another, because our reality is in a vibratory reality. There is nothing static in it. Starting with the nucleus of an atom, which vibrates at enormous rates, the electrons and the molecules are all associated with the characteristic vibratory rates. A most important aspect of matter is vibratory energy. When we think, our brains produce rhythmic electric currents. All right? So everything we learned in this chapter, is he saying that what I'm thinking right now, sending out into the whole universe. So that's why it is true about like positive thinking and like spreading love and peace. You got to have that. You got to be on that vibration, and then it'll just spread. When their magnetic components, they spread out into space at the velocity of light, as do the electric waves or sounds produced by our hearts. They all mingle to form enormous interference patterns, spreading out and away from the planet. They are admittedly weak, but they are there. The more finely our systems are tuned, the clearer a signal we can pick out of the general noise and jumble the sounds. When we have a system of tuned oscillators, even the tiniest signal can be picked up. You may recall that it requires very little energy of the correct frequency to drive a resonant system. Our planet itself is producing shock waves in the plasma that fills the solar system. These shock waves interact with those caused by other planets and produce resonances between the planets and the asteroids. In short, our whole reality is based on one common factor, and that is periodic change or sound. Our senses are geared to respond to all these different sounds, but we are always comparing one sound to another. We can appreciate only the differences in sound. So let's summarize what we read about today with this beautiful little ending symbol here that Itzhak has for us. We have seen various ways of producing sound. We know that when a string or any other structure vibrates, it may develop standing waves. These are waves that occupy a fixed position in a structure, whether it is a string, a plate, or a container filled with liquid, or a blood vessel. Nodes are the spots in which minimum motion occur. When sets of waves are superposed, interference patterns result. A hologram is an interference pattern of light waves on a photographic plate. When two different frequencies are superposed, beat frequencies result. Coherency is an in-step or in-phase behavior of waves. Oscillators are devices that move in periodic repetitive fashion between 2 points of rest. Our bodies are also such devices. Oscillators vibrating out of phase with each other may get locked up into phase through rhythm entertainment. A system of oscillators that is in phase can resonate. Our reality is a vibratory reality filled by sounds of different kinds. We respond to differences in these sounds. And that is chapter 1. Chapter 2 is a look through the super microscope. So the next time I do Beyond the Midnight Book Club, which who knows, might be Saturday, might be next week sometime, whenever you catch me. But beautiful chapter 1. Everything is sounds, everything is vibrations. So be careful the kinds of sounds and vibrations you're putting out there. That's all I got for you. Thanks for joining me for the book club. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back next time for part 2.
What I got, you need. You got. I want.